Welcome to Pioneer Mindset, a place where we challenge our mindset and address the discomfort in both business and life by finding clarity resulting in bold conviction. I'm your host, Garrett Ruskamp, fifth generation farmer, husband, and father from rural Nebraska. Whether you're navigating frustration from past decisions or worry about the uncertainty you face today in your business, we're going to learn from our struggles and take on new challenges with a resilient mindset. Join me as I share my journey of struggles I've faced in agriculture as a farmer and family man. I'm ready to dive into honest conversations to tackle the mindsets surrounding key issues that rural ag business owners face that will ultimately help you gain control, leading to a profitable and sustainable business. Let's adapt to Pioneer Mindset and get to it. Welcome back, everyone. In today's episode, I want to continue to dive into the 6 skill sets that will pay you for life. And just to recap a little bit on the first 2 skill sets that we discovered, first one being speaking and how we speak to different people, the posture that we use, the tone of our voice, different things like that, and who we're talking to, understanding who we're talking to, being aware of the things that maybe they're going through, just kind of really truly understanding how we're speaking and who we're speaking to. The next skill set that we did was the second one, and that was the skill set of seduction or influencing or persuading, and trying to basically persuade people to kind of basically succumb to the things that we want, or how when we're in conversations we want to try to get our way, and talking about basically trying to take into consideration the different interests of people versus the positions of people. So those were kind of the first 2 skill sets, and we covered those individually. Now, the second 2 skill sets I'm going to talk about are kind of in conjunction because I think they kind of go hand in hand. So to get into those, I'd say the third one, as we cover it, would be teaching, and then the fourth one would be training. Now, like I said, the teaching and training, they kind of go hand in hand, but yet I would consider them separately. Now, when we talk about teaching, we talk about, think about who was maybe a good teacher that you had growing up in your childhood or maybe even in college. Who was maybe like a really good teacher or professor that you remember, and what did they do that you liked? Or maybe even think about it from a different perspective is how do you learn and what really helps you learn best? So for me, I was never necessarily one that learned great in the classroom, but there were a couple instances that I could remember. I'd say maybe not necessarily in high school. There's maybe a couple of them that were really good, but I'm going to talk particularly about a college professor or college teacher that we had. One that was really good, I'd say one that fosters curiosity, makes you want to learn, makes it fun and exciting to learn, but also makes the content very relatable to what you're going into or what you're doing. This particular professor, this was talking about soil, which for some, this may not be very interesting, but talking about soil and different things and how that can pertain back to our operation and how everything that we were learning was just very relatable to how we could implement that into the farm, into our own operations. So it made it fun. And I think the thing to consider with teaching is obviously we're talking about the skill set of teaching. So for me, instance, teaching my kids, teaching the boys, or maybe you're trying to teach an employee. Obviously, when it comes to all that, you need to be aware of who you're teaching. You need to be aware of how that person learns. Obviously, that person's season of life, obviously it's different if I'm talking to my boys, which are young, versus an employee, and they're obviously in different stages of life. So we need to be very considerate about that and considerate of the different learning styles that they might have or the individual needs. So really kind of consider what this looks like for you and how you could maybe hone in on the skill set of teaching. Now, one thing when it comes to teaching, and I think that's important to really understand that teaching, I'd say, is more of the book smarts, more of the sort of I don't want to say classroom setting, but more of just learning the ins and outs and definitely learning why we do everything that we do. And I really truly believe that's important if you want to be a good teacher. You need to make the student or whoever you're talking to, your children, the employee, understand why that you're trying to get this point across or learn this specific thing, whatever that is, whatever that looks like. So I think that's very important to understand the why, make sure they understand the why. And one thing I'll kind of give a little bit of story about here is I said I wasn't necessarily the person that learned it best in a classroom. I'd say I learned best outside of the classroom, out in the real world. I'd say especially younger and even in the college years, out getting my hands dirty, seeing visual aspects. That was always very important for me to learn. And I'd say specifically when it came to, say, like learning different things on the farm, I definitely didn't necessarily get taught maybe the best by my dad or whoever, but I'd say I definitely learned by watching and watching them do. And I'd say that's a big part of it is if you want to be a good teacher, you need to teach by doing. So definitely consider that as we talk about the skill set of teaching. Next one, when we talk about training. So teaching and training, they can be kind of put together, but I still think they are separate. So when it comes to training, I'd say training is more of the street smarts, the taking what you learned, the logistics, the book smarts, taking all of that and applying it to our everyday life. So, for example, if maybe in the teaching side of things, if you created really good systems and processes, it's taking those systems and processes and how do we apply those out in the real world. So I think that's a good one. Also for training, you can also train by setting a good example. Back to like your kids. If you're a good example, you can kind of train them by becoming a good example for them. And so I think it's also good to train is to be aware of how the other person's going to learn, like I mentioned. And so maybe some people, for instance, kind of a little bit of a story, is I was actually trying to train my dad on how to run our air seeder that we had just got. And he'd been around it, but he hadn't physically ran it himself. And for me, to be honest, I was still kind of learning some things. So it can be hard to actually teach or train somebody if you're not, say, 100% professional on it yourself or not 100% familiar with it. So that can be a struggle. So you need to obviously make sure that you know the ins and outs of something before you're trying to train somebody else to do it. But when I was trying to train my dad to run this, sometimes people actually do better just saying, here's kind of the basics. Especially when it comes to equipment, that's where I'm talking about specifically with this air seeder, is try to show them what you can, but then got to let them go. And you just got to let them learn and let them make mistakes. And some people might be the opposite, where you actually do need to sit in there with them for, half the field or maybe just the end rows, whatever that takes for them to learn. So that way, if different questions pop up, you're there to answer those questions. But I think the big thing when it comes to training is to give them the space to learn. And also be aware that they are going to mess up, and hopefully it's not too big of a screw up, but how you react in that training process to whatever happens, maybe it's a bit of a screw up, that's really going to affect their training process. And so, for example, with a kid, if you're trying to teach your kids to do something, you're trying to train them to do something, if they screw up, how are you going to react? Are you going to give them the space to actually let them come to you with the mistake that they made? Or are you going to make it hard for that person to actually want to come to you? Or if they do have questions, they're scared of the answer. You don't have an open line of communication for them to actually come to you and get their questions answered so they can continue in their training process. These are just some things that I've noticed, some things that came up for me when we started to talk about the skill sets of teaching and training. The thing that I also want to mention here is the other things that I've noticed is I think we discount everything that we know, especially on the farm, the skills that we have. We've been operating the machinery, we've been doing the different tasks for 10 plus years, 20, 30 plus years, depending on where you're at in your operation. We discount all this little skill sets that we have. So if it comes to trying to teach or train somebody, we cannot possibly try to actually give them all the knowledge that we have. That's why I think systems and processes are important. Something that we are definitely trying to implement more in our operation is taking the time to actually develop those skills and those systems and processes, write down every little detail so that hopefully if we bring somebody else into the operation, we can train them as best as we can or as efficiently as we can, maybe give them that systems and processes, maybe a book, whatever it looks like, maybe it's some videos that they can watch beforehand, say before going to the field. They can watch that, they can take that, and they can actually try to learn from that before actually getting thrown into the seat. And then, when it comes to actually throwing them in the seat, you're there to help train them, to help guide them if they've got questions. Like I said, ride around with them, make sure they're comfortable. But then when you leave, they've still got that manual, so to speak, or that process that they can refer back to. Because there's oftentimes, if you can take the time to be diligent about actually putting every little detail, because we all know if it, for example, air seeder, running, planting, whatever it is, there's actually like 1,000 different things that actually go into that. Make sure you check this, make sure you do this in that order, whatever that looks like. If we can actually take the time to put all that stuff down into a process, that's going to ensure that whoever's trying to learn whatever you're trying to teach them, learn how to go plant, if they've got that process with them, we're setting them up for success because they can refer back to that versus maybe asking you some little detail and then they're always bugging you and you're getting annoyed because the new trainee is always calling you all the time. Well, take it into consideration. If they're not learning and they're not succeeding, you need to take ownership in that you're the one actually trying to train them. So be considerate of that. Take ownership of you're the one training them. So if they're not succeeding, maybe you need to look at yourself. What did you do to teach them or to train them? It's not always that other person's fault. We get pretty easy about pointing fingers at the other people because they're not training, they're not learning fast enough, they're not really paying attention. Well, we need to do the best we can so that way they know exactly what they're doing. And part of that also goes back to the why. I want to say, I can't really harp on that one enough, is if they don't know the why, they're not going to understand why they messed up or the reason that they messed up and why that's so important. So really consider those things. And the other thing I want to hit on here is all of this time, when it comes to teaching and training, I need to, as I speak this, I need to kind of remember it myself. It's a lesson for myself as well, because all of this takes patience. And I know that is easier said than done, and I'm right there with you, but it all takes patience. Some things that I've noticed on the farm or whenever it comes to different tasks is I always tell myself it always takes longer than you think, especially when it comes to different tasks on the farm. It's kind of like the whole thing when you tell your wife, I'll be home in half an hour. Well, then it ends up being 2 hours later because everything always takes longer than you think. That's the way it is when it comes to teaching and training. Now, if it goes well and whoever it is picks up on that thing really quick, well, great. But why don't you actually consider that it's going to take longer than you expect from the beginning, and then maybe you won't be disappointed if it takes that person forever to catch on and forever for them to actually become a master, so to speak, at that thing that you're trying to train them on. These are just some different things that I've learned, that I've experienced as we talk about the skill sets of teaching and training. And I truly believe that if a guy can start to master some of these things, it's going to set us up in our operation, in our personal life. It's going to make those around us that are going to be more successful as well as ourselves. And the other thing, lastly, before I forget to mention on this, is the reason that we cover all of this in the order that we have is because when it comes to teaching and training, we also need to think all the way back to the speaking aspect of it, to the speaking of how we're speaking to that person, how are we speaking to the person we're trying to teach and train. And we also need to consider it, okay, if we're trying to maybe influence them or try to persuade them to do certain things a certain way, that goes back to the seduction skill. So we need to learn these skills kind of in order and try to hopefully set up the person we're talking to for success, as well as ourselves. These are definitely lifelong skills that will pay us for life, but they'll also take a lifetime to ultimately keep on learning and keep on perfecting. So I hope you found value in this, and I thank you for tagging along with me today, and we will catch you next time. Thanks for tagging along with me today as we sharpened our mindsets. If you've gained insight from today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot to share or send this episode to somebody who might also find value in it. For more, follow me on Instagram @GarrettRuskamp or on Facebook, and join me next time for more conviction through clarity.